Okay, we're going to move on now, and our next speaker is Nick Polk. You want to come forward, Nick, and I'll introduce you. So, Nick Polk is the author of Tolkien and Pop Culture, which he just signed for me, and which you can buy out in the foyer, which, don't miss out on the opportunity. This was released in the fall of last year, and he currently serves as the production editor of Malorn, which is the academic journal of the Tolkien Society. He is the creator of the Tolkien Pop Substack, thank you, where he explores the connections between Tolkien and modern life. He's an English teacher, and he has written various articles on Tolkien, adaptation, pop culture, and theology. Ladies and gentlemen, Nick Polk.
Well, thanks for having me, everybody. I will apologize in advance for not having a PowerPoint. Literally every time I try to do a PowerPoint, I get so distracted that I will go through the whole thing without even using it, so I do not have a PowerPoint today. So I'll try to keep you engaged. So I will get started here. So navigating the thought of any person, alive or dead, is one of the greatest challenges of being human in relationship with others. However, working with the thought of a dead person substantially intensifies this challenge, and thus, here we are to meet that challenge. My current attempt at meeting this challenge is working out what Tolkien was explicitly or subconsciously thinking regarding eschatology in his writing. So I'm going to do what Jessica was afraid to, and I'm going to try to get into Tolkien's head here. Specifically, I want to examine where Tolkien's writings resonate with the eschatological doctrine of Christian Universalism. I will primarily survey writings pertaining to his Legendarium with brief references to writings outside of the Legendarium, including his fiction, academic work, and letters. Okay? In doing so, I want to perform and promote a methodology that does not aim for an a priori reconciliatory approach between what is usually dichotomously categorized as Tolkien's fiction and his nonfiction writings. I think that binary distinction is just too simple. Rather, I want to argue that all Tolkien's writings be investigated separately in their context, comparing the location of each item under investigation, in this case, instances of theologies that echo with universalism, with one another, and explore their connections without syncretizing them into a monolithic construct. I will do this by arguing for a hermeneutical theory rooted in the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. And if you're familiar with that tradition, I can see maybe some of you are looking at me like Sam is looking at Bill Ferny, so withhold your apples, please. I have bad reflexes, but I'm going to go, okay? So I'm going to do this with Alfred North Whitehead by connecting his understanding of the expression of language with Tolkien's own understanding of expression as an essential part of the concept of subcreation. So like many of the doctrines within Christian traditions, there are more than one version of universalism. There are others who have written about Tolkien's potential universalism within the Legendarium, but I want to expand upon those writings to argue that the passages examined here will ring of what is termed patristic universalism, which means a universalism with roots in the writings of the fathers of the early church that has carried with it influence in the development of specifically Catholic doctrine. Okay? So historical theologian Morwenna Ludlow summarizes the general concern of patristic universalists. She says, quote, "Although early Christian theologians were clearly concerned for the fates of their neighbors, their universalism typically had a thoroughly cosmic dimension, opening out beyond a concern for contemporary humans to the whole human race, past and future, to all rational creation, including angels and sometimes fallen angels, and in some cases to a hope for the renewal of the whole creation. This cosmic hope was the form in which early universal salvation was typically expressed," unquote. So Tolkien's concept of Arda Heal, for example, fits within this patristic articulation of universalism, as the religious diversity in the Legendarium is extremely sparse, and all of Arda and its inhabitants are the participants named in the traditions that purport an Arda healed. Okay? So many of the passages from Tolkien's Legendarium that I will be exploring are the usual suspects pertaining to the Dagor Daggerath, or the last battle at the end of the world, and the debate between Finrod and Andreth in Morgoth's Ring, since it is Tolkien's latest dealing with the eschatology of Ea, or the world, the universe. So to avoid redundancy, I will lay out a selection of these passages that will be surveyed, indicate where they are from, and provide commentary on them in relation to their textual history. So in the published Silmarillion, first, the last battle is first mentioned in the chapter of Aule and Yavanna. In it, following the making of the dwarves by Aule and their adoption by Eru, it is said that the dwarves believe that after they die, they will wait in a place of their own in the halls of Mandos until the end. Then their part shall be to serve Aule and to aid him in the remaking of Arda after the last battle. So not only is this a glimpse into an Arda healed, but also into its incorporation of those of a different origin than elves and men. And although Eru adopts the dwarves, making them children of Iluvatar, right, their relationship to Eru and destiny differ from elves and men. So where the relationship between Eru and destiny also differs between elves and men, both share similar traditions and lore, especially men of Númenórean descent, lessening the margins of difference between those two races. So the distance of difference closes further since elves and men are biologically the same species as well, okay? In addition, dwarves also have different names for the Valar. For example, calling Aule Mahal. Okay, that's their name for that Vala. So this distinction goes beyond linguistics, as dwarves clearly have differing views pertaining to the destiny of Arda, themselves, and others throughout the Legendarium than elves and men, contributing to the small portion of data within the Legendarium that can be loosely categorized as religious diversity. Okay? So, come back, as opposed to modern theology, the destiny of the religious other is not the sole focus of patristic universalism. However, quote, early Christians did ponder the destiny of those who died before the advent of Jesus, Christ, and of good pagans. Okay? Tolkien does not construct complex religion systems in the Legendarium, but they do exist. Whether one assents to the idea of Arda as truly pre-Christian fantasy, as a pre-Christian fantasy world or not, faithful adherence to the will of Eru, as given through his regents, particularly the Valar, is the proper religious posture. As all conscious beings in the Legendarium are quote-unquote pagan, that is to say, not Christian, the cosmic dimension of the destiny of the diverse peoples of Arda are relevant to the consideration of their universal incorporation into the eschaton of the Legendarium. So the dwarves are a key example of this factor, as their destiny resembles the 20th century Catholic theologian Karl Rahner's concept of the anonymous Christian, which influenced Roman Catholic approaches to the interreligious dialogue during Vatican II, a council Tolkien was not fond of. So this was, albeit his frustration with the Second Vatican Council seems to stem almost exclusively from his feelings towards the reforms in liturgy of the Mass. If you weren't sure, we know this. He was very upset that they were doing the Mass in English or local languages instead of Latin, okay? So interestingly, in a footnote to letter number 250 to his son Michael, where Tolkien dismisses Vatican II in light of the work of Pope Pius X, Tolkien claims, quote, God cannot be limited even by his own foundations, and may use any channel for his grace, unquote. He then gives the caveat that faith in Jesus Christ, as provided through the Roman Catholic Church, is still the ordained course of Christianity. So framing the dwarves as a sort of anonymous children of Iluvatar, with this letter in mind, can lead to a connecting of Tolkien's theological commitments in the primary world to the theological formulations in his secondary one, while sharing a particular angle to a patristic universalism. Okay? So one of the more popular passages for those arguing for universalism in Tolkien's writings is a statement from Finrod in the Athrobeth. Okay? And this is Finrod here. He says, quote, if we are indeed the Erin, the children of the One, then he will not suffer himself to be deprived of his own, not by an enemy, not even by ourselves, unquote. So this statement echoes Tolkien's own claim about God's grace in letter number 250 that I just quoted. And although the Athrobeth was written after the publication of The Lord of the Rings and is placed within a conversation that acknowledges various views of the nature of incarnate beings and the destiny of elves and men, Christopher Tolkien claims in its introduction that, quote, the Athrobeth is a major and finished work and is referred to elsewhere as if it had for my father some authority. And since this text was written during the time in which Tolkien was attempting to further shape the Legendarium through theological and philosophical consistency, right, this in the revision, right, consciously, not consciously at first, except in the revision of that famous letter, it's not difficult to see that some of Tolkien's own theological commitments, as well as wrestlings, are seeped into the Athrobeth. Okay. So in Karl Hostetter's first appendix, The Nature of Middle-earth, entitled Metaphysical and Theological Themes, he says, quote, I take it that Tolkien is saying that The Lord of the Rings, and by extension, his broader Legendarium, is at its core and foundation, or in its essential nature, based on religious and specifically Catholic beliefs and thought, unquote. So rather than explicitly constructing the Legendarium and later its revision as being consistent with a particular view of Christian revelation or with the purpose of being a tool for Catholic evangelism, I concur with Hostetter that Tolkien recognized his faith to be an essential part of his nature. Therefore, the Legendarium as a sub-created secondary world would naturally be shaped by his self-understanding. Okay? So like histories, metaphysical and theological claims, and predictions about the future, the self is not fully revealed and grasped by ourselves or even another. Logic and experience do not always coincide, making knowledge difficult to obtain. In Note 8 to the Athrobeth, Tolkien presents experience as an epistemological authority within the elvish experience. Okay? This is Tolkien's words. He says, quote, actually, the elves believed that the lightning of the heart, or the stirring of joy, to which they often refer, which may accompany the hearing of a proposition or an argument, is not an indication of its falsity, but of the recognition of the Fea, this is the Quenya word for soul, that is on the path of truth, unquote. So he's saying if it feels right, we've talked about if it resonates, we're on the right path to truth, okay? At least for elves anyway. So because Finrod experiences the stirring of joy and the deep hope of Estel, of the eschatological reconciliation of the created world, Arda Heald is seen as an authoritative claim for the destiny of all created beings. On the other hand, Andreth's wisdom tradition does not contain the hopeful eschatology that Finrod's does, therefore making the end of the history of Arda a mystery as it is in the primary world. So this mystery is complicated further with the various versions related to the last battle and the doom of Morgoth. In the Quenta, one of the early versions of the Silmarillion dated circa 1930, it is said in the second prophecy of Mandos, which is not included in the published Silmarillion, that Turin-Turambar will come from the halls of Mandos to fight alongside Tolkis and Fionwe, who would become Eonwe later. Okay, he's one of the one of the emissary original OGs of the elves. Okay, during the last battle, and it shall be the black sword of Turin that deals unto Melko his death and final end. It's like why is it not in there? It's like one of the most gangster endings, right? It's so good. Whereas in the later writings in the Annals of Aman, written circa 1950-51, Tolkien amends this prophecy. He changes it, and he says, quote, Varda took the light that issued from Telperion, and she made stars newer, and greatest of these was Menel Markar, the swordsman of the sky. This was the sign of Turin-Turambar, who shall come into the world, and a foreshadowing of the last battle shall be at the end of days, and a token of doom of Melkor. So now we just see Melkor's doom is on the horizon, but there's no awesome sword thrust into the belly of the great enemy. Okay. So for universalism to be truly cosmic, this must include all beings, including Satan and fallen angels. In this case, Melkor and the Ainur that follow him, if we're translating it into the Legendarium. It is unclear what the fate of Melkor is within the textual history. This is not only because of conflicting or ambiguous accounts, but also metaphysical issues. In letter number 211, Tolkien claims that Ero cannot annihilate a soul. So how, if Melkor's death is his true fate, can he be killed? It is not my intention to answer this question, but to offer the possibility for a reading of universalism for all creation as the second prophecy of Mandos becomes less clear about Melkor's fate as Tolkien continued to revise it over time. So the Matthew de Stefano points out in a Patheo's article entitled, "Was J.R.R. Tolkien a Universalist?" that in the chapter Fog on the Barrow Downs in Book 1 of Lord of the Rings, Tom Bombadil, when exorcising the Barrow-wights from the chamber in which Frodo, Sam, Merry, and Pippin were captured, sings, "Lost and forgotten be, darker than the darkness where gates stand forever shut, till the world is mended." In other words, the gates of the void are shut forever until they're not. Could this mean that Melkor will be restored to his original state before his corruption? I concur with a scholar that I can't pronounce because it's Polish, Olzanski, that this we do not and shall never know. Okay. However, a variety of Tolkien's writing make room for a progressive personal transformation in life and after death. Okay, so we're on this continual journey, right? We're being sanctified, and Tolkien believed that this might even happen after we die. Okay. And Ludlow, I'm going back to Ludlow's words, she says, quote, "Much patristic universalism is driven by belief in the possibility that God can work a progressive transformation of his whole creation. It is this that preserves the particularity of salvation alongside its cosmic scope," unquote. So for some of the patristics, divine punishment after death had a pedagogical purpose, meant to perfect its subject rather than be an eternal conscious torment. Tolkien embraced and understood this kind of eschatological transformation through the doctrine of purgatory. In Tolkien's Faith, by Holly Ordway, she develops Tolkien's purgatorial themes in Leaf by Niggle, and this is her words. She says, quote, "The story presents Tolkien's imagined conception of what purgatory is like, a process of healing, sometimes painful, but always oriented toward heaven. And as he explains in his introductory note, the story also depicts the process of artistic creativity, what he calls subcreation," unquote. So purgatory does not equate to universalism, but the doctrine of purgatory owes much of its development to Origen, one of patristic universalism's early developers. Okay. So, from the examples that I have given from Morgoth's Ring, the Fellowship of the Ring, the Shaping of Middle-earth, and the Silmarillion, it is possible to extract echoes of patristic universalism from them, both individually within their textual history and as being informed by Tolkien's letters, as well as his other fiction, such as Leaf by Niggle. However, each pericope was written separately and at a different point in the development of the Legendarium. None fit together neatly, as Tolkien's primary world theology and theology within Arda likewise do not. It takes textual criticism and selective hermeneutics to construct a patristic, universalistic interpretation of Tolkien's Legendarium, as I have done. Rather than reconcile the whole of Tolkien's writings to reduce them to a singular and immutable interpretation, I want to argue for a hermeneutical method, a method of interpretation that takes seriously the factual evidence available to us in Tolkien's writings, his Catholic faith that informed those writings, and the subjective reality of the reader's presence in our exegesis. So, it is important to recognize the residue of Tolkien's Catholicism throughout his writings, but in attempting to argue for the type of methodology I'm going to put forth, the words of Father Michael Halsall in his book Creation and Beauty in Tolkien's Catholic Vision, I believe are helpful in putting this argument into context. Okay, so Father Halsall, he says, quote, "Many commentators ascribe to Tolkien a false intention that he was promoting, in an apologetic sense, a Christian gospel. Whilst Tolkien's works are suffused with Christian themes and motifs, one could read them independent of any such intention, given that he denied such obvious interpretation of his works," unquote. So Halsall refutes the explicit use of Tolkien as a tool for apologetics, but this apologetic use of Tolkien can also be found implicitly within much theological criticism on Tolkien, and it is this implicit theological reductionism that I position my methodology against. So, Tom Emanuel proposes a hermeneutic of Tolkien that shares my pluralistic ends in his article. Quote, his article is entitled, "It is about nothing but itself, Tolkienian theology beyond the domination of the author." So where Emanuel constructs his hermeneutics from a queer Christian biblical theology and a progressive Jewish midrash to form an interpretive theory of what he calls Tolkienian inspiration, I want to connect Tolkien's idea of freeing language from its hoard and on fairy stories with the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead's notion of expression and language. So both Tolkien and Whitehead express their understanding of the origins of language to be inaccessible. Regardless of the genesis of human language, Tolkien argues that humans have the ability to abstract language from the mysterious depths of etymology to construct new realities in cooperation with the rest of creation, as well as God. However, humans do not produce linguistic worlds ex nihilo, but in a cauldron of story or history that emerge and return to the cauldron with new ingredients and recipes to continue the ongoing process of intellectual human innovation. This is Tolkien's famous theory of subcreation. And for Tolkien, the aim of subcreation is for the subcreator to recognize that they will actually assist in the affiliation and multiple enrichment of creation, and all tales may come true and yet redeemed. Those last couple sentences are Tolkien's words, okay? So the interplay between human and divine creativity is essential for Tolkien as well as Whitehead. In a collection of Whitehead's letters entitled Modes of Thought, Whitehead's second lecture entitled Expression reads logically identical to Tolkien's understanding of language and its function in the entangled human construction of history and myth and on fairy stories. However, Whitehead theorizes how language emerges. He argues that humans experientially presuppose an environment which in its totality we are unable to define. So we experience, we try to articulate it without success entirely, okay? Thus, humans abstract reality through preferential differentiation, which then arises through linguistic expression. So this preferential differentiation emerges from the immanence of the infinite that all creation carries, what Christians may term the imago Dei. But expression is founded on the finite occasion, conditioned by the relation of the expressor, that which is being expressed in the environment that encompasses this occasion. Although humans have the ability to abstract language to fit their communicative ends, both Tolkien and Whitehead argue that for language to achieve good as well as staying power, its speaker needs to be aware of their place in relation to their human and non-human neighbors, while lovingly partnering with them in the continual beautification of their linguistic expression and therefore the world. Tolkien even capitalizes the word expression in naming it a necessary attribute of fantasy after saying, quote, the achievement of the expression which gives or seems to give the inner consistency of reality is art, and the final result, subcreation. So the development and use of language also contains with it a potential for domination, which establishes itself in pure and unrelenting abstraction. Whitehead cautions us, we cannot congratulate ourselves too warmly on the fact that we are born among people who can talk about green and abstraction from springtime, but we must remember the warning, nothing too much. Also, I think it's really interesting that Tolkien talks about abstract language in relation to the green. Why do we say a great green dragon rather than a green great dragon, right? Or a green sun? Is very interesting. Sorry, so that was an interesting coincidence. So, unfortunately, in our self-congratulatory attitude towards the human ability to abstract through language, we tend to dominate and create stagnant pools that many of us call truth or reality. The remedy for Tolkien is for us to open our hoard and let all of the locked things fly away. Okay, so what does this all have to do with patristic universalism? What does this all have to do with a patristic universalistic reading of Tolkien's Legendarium, or the method of interpretation that I'm proposing? So I want to answer these questions with the question that Tom Emanuel asked in his article I referenced above. Why are we treating Tolkien like God in the first place? Okay. Throughout the history of literary criticism, many theories have used the allegory of God for an author and vice versa. Tolkien himself uses this allegory in his own theorizing of authorship. Rather than taking issue with this move, I want to pick it up in the working out of my hermeneutic. How am I on time, by the way?
I'm trusting you.
I think we're fine.
10 minutes, that's it.
Another 10 minutes? Sick. Okay, cool. Sweet. Okay, yeah, God authorship. Here we go. It's cool. So neither Tolkien the author nor the reader share existential supremacy. Similarly, for Whitehead, God as well as creatures have a distinct but necessarily intertwined and shared part in the meaning-making process. Okay? It's not only God alone who makes meaning, but humans in our interaction and partnership with God. So all good and loving possibilities exist eternally in God's nature, while simultaneously actualizing and evolving as it integrates with the physical process of the world. If we take Whitehead's understanding of God and the relational dynamics of God and the world as an allegory to how we can approach interpreting Tolkien, we can recognize that there is factual data from Tolkien's life and work that has been made available to us. However, like the inaccessibility of the origins of language, assuming humans contain characteristics conditioned by the Imago Dei, as well as the entirety of the nature of God, as history marches on, our understanding of them will never be complete. Whitehead puts it this way, quote, "What is done in the world is transformed into a reality in heaven, and the reality in heaven passes back into the world. By reason of this reciprocal relation, the love in the world passes into the love in heaven and floods back again into the world. In this sense, God is the great companion," unquote. And although Tolkien is not God, if we bring this particular allegory of God to understand Tolkien as author, as opposed to more classical theological allegories, Tolkien becomes not an outsider that imposes reality upon ours, but journeys with us in our reading. In turn, our readings contribute to the ongoing reality of Tolkien's being in the world. As readings of Tolkien continue, old and new understandings of him and his work come together to inevitably form something new. To better achieve this reality for the fostering of Tolkien studies, rather than begin with systems of interpretation, taking up the task of understanding the assemblage of realities and then constructing a system from the understanding is what I would argue a more Tolkienian way of reading Tolkien in general. Because the perfecting of subcreation does not end in this life, but is continually redeemed with God's creativity, each perspective on different aspects pertaining to Tolkien's life and works is like a new leaf that contributes to the novelty of the life of God, the world, and perhaps even Tolkien himself. Thanks.
Great stuff, man.
Thanks.
Big conceptual things that my brain is struggling with. But thank you so much. Pause. Do you have a question? Do you have a point? Andrew's straight in there. Lead the way, sir.
I kind of, again, start off with a statement and then go into the question. So with the fellowship, you see Gimli become something more than I think any dwarf has ever been. Part of that's through his relationship with Legolas, but I think more than anything, it's his relationship with the fellowship and the work they're doing, and in particular, the three hunters. They come together in a way that they've never been unified before to do something really crazy. Do you think that's an image of redemption, universal redemption, of one of the Valar's work? So instead of like Gimli finding redemption there, it's a redemption of Aule's work and his disobedience. And it's you know, is it finally Iluvatar saying the eucatastrophe, that whatever, the thing that Melkor tried to do, I'm overcoming that. And what you did in your well-meaning but impatient, or well-meaning impatience, I've also redeemed. Do you see that there with that, or am I barking up a wrong tree?
No, I think it's that and more, because the dwarves afterwards have this, history of what does it mean for, what's their origins, what's their purpose, what happens when they die, what happens after they die. And Gimli, in his interaction with the Fellowship and his befriending of Legolas, does all that, is redeemed by Iluvatar, and then even transcends that. Yeah, it goes to Valinor, right? That's goes beyond what an orc. So it's almost like this Gimli, through his own acts and his freedom and his resonance with Iluvatar's will, his positive response is redeemed by Iluvatar, but then also through his participation goes beyond what is, expected of a dwarf, whether it's from Iluvatar or from the tradition of the dwarves themselves. Yeah.
Just to follow up, so essentially, drawing on the process metaphysics of Whitehead, it's an open-ended ontology, right? I mean, so to my mind, I immediately think of theosis, right? The idea of becoming. Although at the same time, I guess the tension I'm having. So in the process paradigm, there is a symbiotic relation between God and the world. That is eternal, right? It will always continue to develop, right? Which is not necessarily an accepted, Christian interpretation of Scripture, right? We can grant that. That's process metaphysics. But for the fathers, theosis has a particular telos, and that is conformity to the image of Jesus Christ. There is an exemplar of humanity in the mind of God, to which is incarnated as Jesus Christ, but from the foundation of the world, in which image human beings are made, and to which image our goal is conformity in reality or whatever. So I'm just wondering how I'm feeling a tension between that kind of specific eschatological telos that you get in the fathers and the process thing, and I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that.
Totally.
Yeah.
So there is definitely not and I don't want to argue too that there is that those are compatible, or even that Tolkien was arguing for that. But, so for those of you, the idea of God, for Orthodox Christianity, and there's going to be a completion of the world. God's going to come back, heal it. In order for us to experience that, we have to conform ourselves to Christ. Process comes along and says, actually, for eternity, there's going to be this open-ended growing of the universe and God together. There's not really going to be a completion. And so the way that people deal with, what's our purpose? What's our meaning? That's different is that there is a Neoplatonic thing that happens where God is still telling us, God has a nature that says, this is what you need to do. This is what love looks like from my nature. This is what goodness looks like from my nature. And I want to influence you and call you to live that out in the universe, to embody that for eternity. So there's that tension, but I think the element of like God's calling, or what Whitehead calls God's aim or lure, is that, so I think that is present within. You could read that into Christian meaning, and I think there's some of that you can read in Tolkien too. Yeah.
Cool. Go ahead.
So, twofold question. In your argument for a hermeneutical reading of Tolkien, you are talking about the reader or person and Tolkien being on like the same interpretive level, so to speak. Am I correct? Or you're saying that you're not prioritizing the authorial voice of interpreting the work. You're saying that the reader co-interprets with the author. And if so, my second part of the question is, what does that look like to you, practically speaking?
Yeah, so I may be failing at this and wanting my cake and eating it too, but I don't like the hard line of relying on the reader response theory, which is this idea of like, oh, it doesn't matter what the author had written, it only matters what we interpret because it only matters to our subjective experience. I don't like an entirely relying on that, because there's obviously a text that has meaning that informs interpretation. So I think that with reading this sort of Whiteheadian view, that I think that we can acknowledge that Tolkien had a certain trajectory to say, like, I can't say that there's no data that says, like, oh, Tolkien was actually a Muslim and was promoting a sort of a form of Islamic metaphysics or something. You can't get that. That's impossible, okay? Now, can a Muslim read it and say, this resonates with my experience? Absolutely, right? But I think there's this idea of, like, we take what Tolkien said and we can acknowledge Tolkien did not mean this. There's people who argue that Tolkien was secretly an atheist, and I'm like, you're crazy. But on the other end, I think that us reading our experience into that contributes and then when we speak it out and talk to other people, not only do we grow our own interpretation, but Tolkien's understanding and his breadth and his, like, Tolkien as like an idea and as a living author or as like a saint or whatever, I don't know how you want to articulate that, grows within a community of people who talk about him, as well as individual readings. So it's a both and, I think, but maybe I fail at that, I don't know.
I wanted to make an observation very quickly because it's something that I've not heard much about it, but you talked about the swordsman of the sky, the comparison between originally the black sword was going to deal the death blow and then it sort of gets turned into this constellation. But it's still the emblem of ultimate victory and ultimate hope, right? And it turns up in The Lord of the Rings at the woody end, where the hobbits have just been rescued from possibly their most dangerous moment, I'm not even sure. And the clouds clear away, and the swordsman of the sky is above them, and the elves all burst into song. And it's clearly a moment of a sort of pre-religious worship or something like that, but a response to ultimate victory, which I don't have a comparative experience of, but I feel jealous of. Like there's something in that moment so I love that you brought that up, that's the swordsman of the sky moment. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but that was just my big reaction moment in that, what you were saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tolkien believed that. You know, for me, I'm surprise, I'm giving a Whiteheadian reading because I am a Whiteheadian. And so I am a heretic in not believing in a sort of completion of the end, okay? I believe in an open-ended future. I don't think Tolkien believed that at all, okay? But I think that there is moments where I would say we can read this understanding of God luring his creation, right? Even if you believe that God is going to have a victory at the end. God's calling us to form our lives and acknowledge a certain way to live in the world. And I think that something that I won't ever have as a Whiteheadian is that, we haven't experienced an eschaton, God's victory completed, as far as the second coming comes. But anyway, I agree with you that there's a sort of envy that I have for that, and I think it's really cool. Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Nick Polk. Thanks so much, man.